A blind man stands alone at a truck stop in the middle of the Texas night. In his bag, wrapped in a cotton shirt, is the only thing he has left, a photograph he will never see again. It's a picture of his wife. She died 3 years ago, and he hasn't visited her grave since the funeral. Tonight, he's trying to cross 1,500 miles with $47 and no ride. When a thief reaches into his bag and tries to steal that photograph, a trucker steps out of the shadows. Then another. Then another. What happens next will be talked about on every highway in America. And it starts with a dead woman's smile in a wooden frame. The fluorescent lights of the iron skillet truck stop hummed their constant tuneless note against the November sky outside Amarillo, Texas. 18-wheelers lined the lot like sleeping beasts, their engines ticking as they cooled in the 40-degree air. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with the greasy warmth drifting from the diner's kitchen, where Donna Wheeler was wiping down the counter and watching the clock crawl past 11 at night. She noticed the man before anyone else did. He stood near Pump 9, alone, a canvas duffel bag hanging from his left shoulder and a white cane gripped in his right hand. He wore a faded army field jacket, 2 sizes too large, the kind they sold at surplus stores for $12, except this one still had the name tape stitched above the breast pocket. Harrison. His boots were worn at the heels, and his dark hair was cut military short, though it had grown out just enough to suggest he hadn't seen a barber in weeks. He stood perfectly still, his face turned toward the road as if he were watching the headlights of passing trucks. Except his eyes didn't track them. They didn't track anything. James Harrison had not seen light in 6 years. The IED had detonated 14 feet from his Humvee on a road outside Fallujah in the spring of 2006. Sergeant Harrison had been 27 years old, on his second deployment, 11 months married. The blast killed his driver and the interpreter sitting behind him. It left James with second-degree burns across his left arm, a shattered eardrum that eventually healed, and bilateral optic nerve damage that did not. The doctors at Landstuhl, then at Walter Reed, used words like catastrophic and irreversible, while James sat in the dark and tried to remember every detail of his wife's face before the memory faded the way his sight had. Margaret. Brown hair that curled at her shoulders, a freckle beneath her left eye. The way she tilted her head when she laughed, always to the right, as though the joy in her was too heavy for one side alone. He had memorized her before the war, not knowing he would need to. And when the world went black and permanent, those memories became the architecture of everything he had left. Margaret had been the one to meet him at Walter Reed. She had been the one to learn Braille alongside him, to reorganize their apartment in Savannah so he could navigate by touch, to read him the morning paper in a voice that made even headlines about tax reform sound like love letters. She had been 28 years old and already fighting a war of her own that neither of them knew about yet. The ovarian cancer was diagnosed 8 months after James came home. Stage 3. Margaret told him on a Tuesday evening while they sat on the back porch of her mother's house, and James remembered the exact sound of the cicadas because he had tried to focus on anything other than the way her voice cracked on the word aggressive. She died 14 months later. She was 29. James was 31, blind, and now alone in a world he could not see and no longer wanted to. For 2 years after Margaret's death, he drifted. The VA placed him in transitional housing in Amarillo, far from Savannah, far from the cemetery where Margaret lay beneath a magnolia tree in Bonaventure. He attended therapy sessions that felt like filling out forms for grief. He learned to navigate bus routes and grocery stores with his cane. He collected his disability check on the 1st of every month and spent most of it on rent, and little of it on food, and none of it on anything that resembled a future. But he kept the photograph. It was a 4x6 print from their wedding day, framed in a simple wooden border that Margaret's mother had given them. James could not see it. He had not seen it since the day it was taken, but he carried it in his duffel bag, wrapped in a cotton undershirt, and every night he would take it out and hold it and run his thumb along the frame's edge, and he would talk to her. Tonight, November 14th, was the eve of the 3rd anniversary of Margaret's death. And James Harrison had decided 6 days ago that he was going to Savannah. He had taken a Greyhound from Amarillo at 5 in the morning. The bus had broken down outside of Adrian, Texas, the midpoint of Route 66, though James couldn't see the sign, and the replacement bus wouldn't arrive until the following afternoon. A fellow passenger had offered him a ride to the nearest truck stop, and now here he was, standing at pump 9 with $47 in his jacket pocket, a dead phone, and 1,500 miles between him and the only place in the world that still mattered. Donna Wheeler pushed open the diner's glass door and walked toward him, drying her hands on her apron. "Honey, you want to come inside? It's getting cold out here." James turned his head toward her voice. "I'm all right, Mom, just waiting on a ride." "A ride to where?" "East," he said, and then quieter. "Georgia." Donna looked at his cane and his duffel bag and the name tape on his jacket and felt something tighten in her chest. "Well, you're welcome to wait inside. Coffee's on me." James hesitated, then nodded. She guided him through the door without touching him. She could tell he was the kind of man who would rather stumble than be carried, and sat him at the counter near the register where she could keep an eye on him. He set his duffel bag on the stool beside him and rested one hand on it, fingers lightly gripping the strap, as if even here, in a fluorescent-lit diner that smelled of bacon grease and pine sol, something might try to take it from him. He was right. Derek Simmons had been working truck stops along Interstate 40 for the better part of a year. He was 27, lanky, with a forgettable face, and the practiced ease of someone who had learned to read vulnerability, the way a mechanic reads engine trouble. He looked for the tired, the distracted, the alone. He stole wallets from jackets left on bathroom hooks. He pocketed phones from counters when their owners turned to refill coffee. He never took enough to justify a police report, just enough to fund another week of drifting. He noticed James Harrison within 10 minutes of entering the Iron Skillet diner. The cane was the first thing. Then the way the man's eyes stayed fixed on a point somewhere above the coffee cup Donna had placed in front of him. Then the duffel bag sitting unguarded on the next stool with the zipper half open. Derek ordered a cup of coffee he didn't intend to pay for and took a seat 3 stools down, watching. At 12:15 in the morning, James excused himself to use the restroom. He took his cane but left his bag. He had done this 100 times at the VA shelter, left his things, come back, found them untouched. The world, in his experience, was not generous, but it was usually not predatory either. Derek waited until James disappeared around the corner. Then he slid off his stool, stepped to James's seat, and reached into the duffel bag. His hand found the cotton undershirt first, then the hard rectangle beneath it. He pulled out the framed photograph and glanced at it. A woman in a white dress, smiling, and shoved it under his jacket. He reached deeper into the bag, fingers searching for a wallet, and found one, thin, leather, holding what felt like a few bills and a VA identification card. "Put it back." The voice came from directly behind him, low and flat, and carrying the kind of authority that doesn't come from volume. Derek turned and found himself looking at a chest roughly the width of a refrigerator, clad in a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked up. Robert Mitchell was 6'3" and 240 pounds, most of it distributed across shoulders that had spent 24 years hauling freight, changing tires, and wrestling with stuck fifth-wheel pins in the rain. His face was weathered, his hair was grey at the temples, and his eyes were the pale blue of a man who had seen every kind of human behavior that Interstate 40 had to offer and was not impressed by any of it. "I said put it back," Robert repeated. "I wasn't—" "You were. I watched you. Put the wallet back, put the picture back, and then walk out that door." Derek's eyes darted toward the exit. Robert didn't move, but something in his posture shifted. A slight squaring of the shoulders, a redistribution of weight to his front foot, that communicated very clearly that the distance to the door was longer than Derek thought. Derek put the wallet back. He pulled the framed photograph from under his jacket and set it on the counter. Then he walked out the door without his coffee. Robert watched him cross the parking lot, get into a rusted sedan, and drive away. Then he looked down at the photograph on the counter. A young woman in a wedding dress, laughing, her brown hair catching the light. She looked like someone who had been happy. He set the photograph gently back into the duffel bag, wrapped it in the undershirt the way it had been, and was zipping the bag closed when James came back around the corner, his cane tapping softly against the tile floor. "Someone was going through your bag," Robert said, because he didn't see the point in lying. "I stopped him. He's gone." James's hand shot to the duffel bag. He unzipped it, reached inside, found the undershirt, felt the frame beneath it. His fingers traced the edges, and Robert watched the man's entire body release a breath he must have been holding since the moment he heard a stranger's voice near his belongings. "Thank you," James said. "Don't mention it." Robert sat down on the stool Derek had vacated. "You military?" "Was, Army Sergeant." "My old man was Army. Korea." Robert signaled Donna for 2 coffees. "You waiting on somebody?" "A ride. My bus broke down outside Adrian." "Where you headed?" "Savannah, Georgia." Robert looked at James, at his cane, at the duffel bag he was now gripping with both hands, at the hour on the clock above the register. "Savannah's about 1,500 miles from here." "I know. You got somebody meeting you there?" James was quiet for a moment. "No, just somewhere I need to be." Donna brought the coffees. She set James's cup exactly where it had been before. She'd noticed his hand knew the spot, and gave Robert a look that said she'd been listening and he had better not walk away from this one. Robert drank his coffee and thought about 1,500 miles. His route ran east to Memphis, then back west to Lubbock. Memphis was a third of the way. He thought about the photograph he'd seen in the duffel bag, the young woman's face, the wedding dress. He thought about his own daughter, Grace, who lived in Chattanooga and hadn't answered his calls in 3 years. "I'm running a load to Memphis," Robert said. "That's about 600 miles in the right direction. I can take you that far." "I can't pay much." "Did I ask for money?" James turned his face toward Robert's voice. In the world of the blind, you learn to hear things that sighted people miss. The micro shifts in tone that reveal sincerity or its absence. The rhythm of a voice that tells you whether a man is offering help because he means it or because he wants something. Robert Mitchell's voice was a low, steady rumble with no hooks in it. "All right," James said. "Thank you." Robert finished his coffee and stood. "My rig's parked in row 3, Blue Kenworth. Give me 20 minutes to finish my pre-trip and we'll roll." He walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back. "You eat?" "Not since this morning." Robert looked at Donna. "Give him whatever he wants. Put it on my tab." He pushed through the door and into the cold, and as he crossed the parking lot toward his truck, he pulled out his phone and opened the CB radio app that linked him to the trucker networks he'd been part of for 2 decades. He typed a message into the general channel, the one monitored by drivers across the southern corridor. "Got a blind vet stranded in Amarillo. Needs to get to Savannah by tomorrow evening. I can take him to Memphis. Need a relay east from there. Who's running?" By the time he'd finished his pre-trip inspection, 4 drivers had responded. They left the Iron Skillet at 1:15 in the morning. Robert's Blue Kenworth pulling 42,000 pounds of industrial lighting fixtures bound for a warehouse in Memphis. James sat in the passenger seat with his duffel bag between his boots and his cane propped against the dash. The cabin smelled of coffee, diesel, and the faint pine of an air freshener that had stopped working months ago. For the first hour, neither of them spoke much. Robert drove. James listened to the road, the particular song of an 18-wheeler at highway speed, the baritone vibration of the engine, the rhythmic thump of expansion joints in the pavement. He had ridden in military vehicles that sounded worse and smelled worse, and there was something almost comforting about the predictability of this machine, the way it held the lane with the steady confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Outside Shamrock, Texas, Robert broke the silence. "The picture in your bag. That your wife?" "Yes." "She's pretty." Robert caught himself. She was pretty. "Sorry." "She is pretty," James said. Present tense. She doesn't stop being pretty just because she's gone. Robert glanced at him. "Fair enough." "What was her name?" "Margaret. We grew up together in Savannah, started dating junior year, got married right before my second deployment." James paused. "She died 3 years ago tomorrow. Cancer." Robert gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. He had watched his own mother die of cancer in 1994, lung cancer, the kind that comes from 40 years of Virginia Slims, and he remembered every detail of those last months with a clarity he wished he didn't have. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "People say that. I know they mean it. But sorry doesn't change the geography." James touched the duffel bag at his feet. I haven't been back to visit her since the funeral. The VA put me in housing in Amarillo. I kept saying I'd go back, next month, next year. And then 3 years went by, and I realized I'd been making excuses because I was afraid. Afraid of what? James didn't answer immediately. The truck passed a mile marker, its reflective surface flickering in the headlights that James could not see. Afraid that standing at her grave would make it final. As long as I don't go, there's still some part of me that can pretend she's just in the next room, that I'll hear her voice if I wait long enough. He shook his head slowly. That's what blindness does to you. It makes the whole world imaginary. Everyone's just a voice, and if you try hard enough, you can hear any voice you want. Robert drove in silence for a while, turning those words over. He thought about Grace, his daughter who was alive, who was real, who was 3 years of unanswered calls away. He hadn't lost her to cancer or a war. He'd lost her to his own stubbornness and the accumulated weight of 1,000 small failures. Missed birthdays, broken promises. A divorce that he'd handled with all the emotional grace of a man backing a loaded trailer into a ditch. My daughter won't talk to me, Robert said suddenly, surprising himself. He hadn't planned to say it. But there was something about sitting in the dark with a blind man that made the truth easier. No one was watching. No one could see. James tilted his head slightly. How long? 3 years, about the same as you. What happened? I happened. I was on the road 300 days a year. Her mother raised her. When the divorce came, I fought for custody I didn't deserve and lost visitation I could have kept if I'd just shut my mouth and shown up. Robert exhaled. She lives in Chattanooga, hour and a half from where I'm taking you. Maybe you should call her. Maybe she'd hang up. Maybe I'd deserve it. They drove. Texas became Oklahoma, flat and dark and endless. The CB radio crackled intermittently with chatter from other drivers, weather reports, traffic, the usual complaints about dispatch and way stations. Somewhere past Oklahoma City, Earl Patterson's voice came through, deep and graveled. Mitchell, this is Earl Patterson, running LP to Atlanta. I can pick up your passenger in Memphis and take him through Mississippi and into Alabama. Got a fuel stop in Meridian and another in Birmingham. That puts him 6 hours from Savannah. Robert keyed the mic. Copy that, Earl. We're about 8 hours out from Memphis. Appreciate it. He really a vet? He really is. Then it's settled. Semper Fi. Earl was a Marine. Of course he was. Outside Henrietta, the rain started. It came without warning, the way November storms do on the southern plains. One moment the air was cold and still, and the next, the windshield was a wall of water, and Robert was downshifting and tightening his grip and watching his mirrors for the headlights of anyone stupid enough to be driving too fast behind a fully loaded 18-wheeler in zero visibility. James felt the change in the truck's rhythm, the slight deceleration, the wipers snapping to their highest speed, the tension in Robert's silence. Bad? James asked. Been worse, but we might need to pull over for a bit. They found a rest area outside McAllister, and Robert parked the rig and killed the engine. The rain hammered the roof of the cab like 1,000 tiny fists. In the sudden quiet beneath the noise, James reached into his duffel bag, found the photograph, and held it. You do that a lot, Robert said. Do what? Hold the picture. I can't see her, but I can hold her. James's thumb traced the edge of the frame. The wood is starting to smooth out. 3 years of this. Someday the edges will be completely round, and it'll feel like a different frame. And I'll have worn away the last thing that's exactly the way it was when she touched it. Robert looked away, out at the rain, and felt something crack in the part of his chest where he kept the things he didn't talk about. The storm passed in 40 minutes. They rolled east. Arkansas came and went in the dark hours before dawn, the Ouachita Mountains rising and falling around them like the breathing of some ancient sleeping thing. James slept for an hour, the photograph still in his hands, and Robert drove and thought about time and how it moves differently when you're running toward something instead of away from it. At 6:15 in the morning, just west of the Mississippi River Bridge, Robert's engine coughed. It coughed again. The temperature gauge spiked. A red light appeared on the dashboard, the coolant warning, and Robert felt his stomach drop the way it does when a machine you trust suddenly tells you it can't be trusted anymore. What is it? James asked, waking instantly to the change in the engine's voice. Coolant problem. Could be a hose, could be worse. I need to get off the highway. He found an exit, nursed the truck down a two-lane road, and pulled into a gravel lot beside a feed store that wouldn't open for hours. Steam curled from beneath the hood. The engine ticked and groaned. Robert climbed down and opened the hood and looked at the damage. A coolant hose had split, not catastrophically, but enough to drain the system. He could patch it with the right clamp and enough coolant, but he didn't have either. He stood in the grey dawn and stared at the broken hose and felt something dangerously close to defeat. Robert was on the phone within minutes. The trucker network, that invisible web of men and women who spent their lives on asphalt and communicated in CB handles and mile markers, responded the way it always did when one of its own was in trouble, which is to say, it responded without hesitation and without being asked twice. Carl Bennett, an independent owner-operator out of Memphis who had been following the CB chatter about the blind veteran since Oklahoma, arrived at the gravel lot in a red Peterbilt 40 minutes later. He was 38, built like a mechanic because he was one, with grease permanently embedded in the creases of his knuckles. He looked at the split hose, walked back to his truck, and returned with a toolbox, a hose clamp, and a jug of coolant. "This'll hold until Memphis," Carl said, working the clamp into place. "But you're going to need to replace this hose before you run back west." "I know it," Robert said. "Appreciate you coming out." Carl straightened up and looked at the passenger seat of Robert's cab, where James sat with his duffel bag, facing forward, waiting with the practiced patience of a man who had learned that most of life's problems were solved by other people while he sat in the dark. "That him. That's him." Carl wiped his hands on his jeans. "Earl Patterson just radioed. He's at the pilot in West Memphis, fueled up and ready. Says he can have your man in Birmingham by mid-afternoon." Robert nodded. He had known from the moment he typed that first message on the CB app that the relay would work. He had seen it before, not for a blind veteran carrying his dead wife's photograph, but for stranded drivers, for families broken down on the shoulder, for anyone in trouble on the road. Truckers fought. It was what they did. Not with fists, usually. With miles, with diesel, with the simple, stubborn refusal to let someone be alone when they didn't have to be. They reached the pilot truck stop in West Memphis by 9 in the morning. Earl Patterson was waiting at Pump 6 in a silver Freightliner, a cup of gas station coffee in his hand and a Marine Corps cap on his head. He was 56, with a white beard and forearms like bridge cables, and the quiet, steady presence of a man who had seen combat and come home and spent the next 30 years being kind to strangers as a form of penance or prayer. Robert parked beside Earl's rig and helped James down from the cab. It was the first time they had stood face to face in daylight, and Robert saw details he'd missed in the dark. The scar tissue at James's left temple, the way his hands never fully relaxed, the careful economy of his movements, as if every step was a negotiation with a world designed for people who could see it. "James, this is Earl. He's going to take you through Mississippi and Alabama." James extended his hand. Earl shook it with both of his. "Sergeant Harrison, it's an honor," Earl said. "I did 2 tours in Beirut, Marines. I know what you gave." "Thank you for doing this," James said. "Son, I've been driving these roads for 30 years, and this is the first time I've had a reason." Earl picked up James's duffel bag and carried it to his truck. "We'll be in Birmingham by 3. I've got a driver named Hank Collins running a flatbed to Macon. He'll take you from Birmingham, and from Macon, it's 3 hours to Savannah." The relay, 3 trucks, 4 drivers, 1,500 miles, all for a man they'd never met, carrying a picture he couldn't see, trying to reach a woman who couldn't know he was coming. Robert stood by his truck and watched Earl help James into the Freightliner's passenger seat. He felt something he hadn't expected, a reluctance to let go. In 12 hours, James Harrison had become something Robert hadn't had in years, someone to drive for. Not freight, not miles, not a paycheck. A person. "Hey, James." James turned his head toward Robert's voice. "When you get to Savannah, when you're standing there." Robert paused. "Tell her somebody was looking out for you." James's expression didn't change, but his hand found the duffel bag and gripped it, and he nodded once. Earl's Freightliner pulled onto the interstate and headed east. Robert stood in the parking lot of the pilot truck stop in West Memphis and listened to the engine fade. Then he pulled out his phone and stared at the screen. 3 years of silence. 3 years of a number he knew by heart, but hadn't dialed. Chattanooga was 90 minutes from Savannah. He dialed. It rang 4 times. 5. He was composing the voicemail in his head, something about time and regret and the things you learn from a blind man in a truck. When the line connected. "Dad," Grace's voice. Older now, a woman's voice, not the girl he remembered. But underneath it, the same inflection, the same rising note of surprise that was either the beginning of a welcome or the sharp intake before a door closes. "Hey, sweetheart," Robert said. His voice cracked. He hadn't expected that. 24 years of driving, and the highway had never broken his voice. A 3-letter word did. "I know it's been a long time. I know I don't have the right to call." Silence on the line. Then, "Where are you?" "West Memphis." "Are you okay?" "Yeah. Yeah, I'm okay. He watched a truck pull out of the lot, its taillights glowing red in the morning haze. "I met somebody today, a vet, blind. He's carrying a picture of his wife who passed, and he's trying to get to her grave in Savannah. And I helped him, and a bunch of other drivers helped him, and the whole time I kept thinking about you, and how I never fought for you the way these guys are fighting for him. And I should have. I should have fought harder." Silence again, longer this time. "I'm not going anywhere, Dad," Grace said, and her voice had changed. The guard was still there, but it had lowered, just a fraction, just enough to let the light in. "When you're done driving, come to Chattanooga. We'll talk." Robert closed his eyes and pressed the phone against his forehead and breathed. Meanwhile, Earl Patterson drove east through Mississippi with James beside him, and they talked about Beirut and Fallujah, about wives and loss, about the particular kind of silence that fills a house when the person who made it home is gone. They stopped for fuel in Meridian, where the gas station attendant, a woman named Ruth, learned why they were driving and refused to let Earl pay. They stopped again in Birmingham, where Hank Collins was waiting with his flatbed, a thermos of coffee, and a handwritten note from his wife that said, "Tell the soldier we're praying for him." Hank couldn't bring himself to give it to James. Prayer felt too small for what this man was carrying. So he tucked it into James's duffel bag when James wasn't paying attention. Hank drove James through Alabama and into Georgia as the afternoon light turned gold and the landscape softened into the red clay and live oaks of the coastal plain. James felt the air change through the vent, warmer, wetter, carrying the salt and pine smell of the low country. He hadn't smelled that air in 3 years. His hands tightened on the photograph in his lap. "We're about an hour out," Hank said. "I know," James said. "I can smell it." They arrived in Savannah at 6:40 in the evening, the city already settling into the blue-gray light that comes to the coast in November, when the sun drops early and the Spanish moss turns silver in the dusk. Hank Collins pulled his flatbed into the parking lot of a gas station on Victory Drive, 3 miles from Bonaventure Cemetery, and turned off the engine. "I can take you the rest of the way," Hank said. "If you could get me a cab, that would be enough. You've already done more than I can repay." But Hank shook his head. "I didn't drive 400 miles to drop you at a gas station. Come on." He drove James to the cemetery entrance, the stone gates with the iron letters spelling Bonaventure, and parked on the shoulder. It was nearly 7 o'clock. The cemetery closed at sundown, but the gates were still open, and the groundskeeper, an older man named Wallace, was locking the utility shed when he saw the flatbed truck and the man with the white cane stepping down from the passenger side. Wallace walked over. "Cemetery's about to close, sir." "I know," James said. "I'm looking for my wife, Margaret Harrison. She's in section 14, near the river, under a magnolia tree." Wallace studied the man's face, the unfocused eyes, the scar at his temple, the way he held his cane like a sword he was tired of carrying. Then he looked at the duffel bag and the shape of the picture frame pressing through the canvas. "I know where she is," Wallace said. "I'll walk you there." He offered his arm. James hesitated, then took it. Hank followed a few steps behind, carrying nothing, saying nothing, knowing that the last quarter mile of a 1,500-mile journey was not his to narrate. They walked along the cemetery's main path, past the ancient oaks draped in moss, past the marble angels and the headstones that had been there since before the Civil War. The Wilmington River was visible through the trees, its surface catching the last light of the day. The air smelled of earth and salt and the particular sweetness of magnolia leaves in decay. Not the blossoms which come in spring, but the leaves themselves, thick and waxy, curling brown at the edges as they fell. James knew this place. He had been here once, on a day he had tried every day since to forget and had failed. He could feel the gravel change to grass beneath his boots and the temperature drop as they moved under the canopy of the magnolia tree, and he knew, without seeing, without being told, that they had arrived. "Here she is," Wallace said, and released James's arm. James stood still. The ground beneath him was soft and even, and he could feel the slight mound where the earth had settled over 3 years. He reached down and touched the headstone, smooth granite, cool to the touch, and his fingers found the letters cut into the stone. Margaret Ann Harrison. Beloved wife, 1981, 2009. He traced each letter the way he had once traced the lines of her face, slowly, completely, as if reading were the same thing as remembering. His fingers lingered on the word beloved. It was not enough. No single word was. But someone had chosen it, and it was true, and the stone would hold it long after the people who knew her were gone. James unzipped his duffel bag and took out the photograph. He held it in both hands, the frame facing outward toward the headstone, as if he were showing Margaret her own face, as if he were saying, "I brought you back to you." "Hey, Maggie," he said. His voice was quiet, conversational, the way you talk to someone who is sitting across from you at the kitchen table. Not the voice of grief, not the voice of ceremony, the voice of a man talking to his wife. "I'm sorry it took so long. I was scared. I think you know that. You always knew the things I didn't say." He paused. "I can't see you. I haven't been able to see you for a long time. But I remember. I remember the freckle under your eye and the way you tilted your head when you laughed. I remember the dress you wore the day we got married. I remember the sound of your voice when you read me the paper in the morning. And I remember the way the bed felt when you were in it, and the way it felt when you weren't." He pressed the photograph against his chest. "I got here because of strangers, Maggie. Truck drivers. Men I'd never met who drove me across 4 states because they thought you were worth driving for. And they were right. You were worth every mile." Behind him, Hank Collins stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes burning. Beside Hank, Wallace, the groundskeeper, removed his cap and held it against his chest. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. James knelt on the grass beside the headstone. He placed the photograph against the base of the stone, leaning it carefully so it faced upward, toward the sky he couldn't see. "I'm not going to carry you anymore," he said. "Not because I don't love you, because I do. And carrying you in my bag, like something I'm afraid to lose, that's not love. That's fear. And you never taught me to be afraid." He rested his hand on the top of the headstone and felt the granite absorb the warmth from his palm. In Savannah, even in November, the stone holds heat longer than you'd expect. "I'm going to leave the picture here, with you, where it belongs." His voice broke just once, just on the last word, and then he pulled it back together with the discipline of a man who had been trained to hold the line. "But I'll come back. I know the way now. Some good people showed me the way." He stayed there for a long time. The light faded, the moss in the oaks turned from silver to shadow. The river beyond the trees caught the last red streak of sunset and held it briefly like a memory. When James finally stood, his hand was steady and his face was dry. He picked up his cane, shouldered his duffel bag, lighter now by the weight of a 4x6 photograph in a wooden frame, and turned toward the sound of Hank's breathing. "Thank you," James said, "for everything." Hank nodded, forgetting that James couldn't see it, and then said, "Yes, sir," in a voice that was rougher than he wanted it to be. They walked back to the truck in silence. In West Memphis, Robert Mitchell was in his Kenworth, parked at the Pilot, staring at a text message from his daughter. "Thanksgiving is in 2 weeks. Come to Chattanooga. I'll make Mom's cornbread." He read it 4 times. Then he typed back, "I'll be there." In Meridian, Mississippi, Earl Patterson was fueling his Freightliner for the run back to Little Rock. His wife called to ask when he'd be home. "Tomorrow," he said, "but I need to tell you about today." In Birmingham, Carl Bennett was under the hood of his Peterbilt, replacing a fuel filter, when his phone buzzed. A message on the Trucker CB app from a handle he didn't recognize. Hank here. The Sidgerite made it. He's at the grave. Just thought you all should know. Carl read it, set down his wrench, and sat on the bumper of his truck for a full minute, looking at the sky. At a gas station on Victory Drive, Hank Collins helped James into a cab that would take him to a VA facility in Savannah where he could stay for the night. Before James got in, he turned back. Hank, the men who drove me, Robert, Earl, Carl, you, will you tell them something for me? Anything. Tell them Margaret would have liked them. She always said the best people are the ones who show up when they don't have to. Hank watched the cab pull away. He stood in the parking lot with his hands in his pockets and the November air cool on his face and the distant sound of the river somewhere beyond the trees. Then he got back in his truck, turned the key and pointed it west. He had a long drive home, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a long drive. It felt like the right distance, covered for the right reasons, carrying something that weighed nothing and meant everything. The road stretched out before him, and the road was good.